This video covers the following themes. Viewer discretion is advised.
If you grew up during the 2000s and 2010s like me, then you're probably familiar with this face. Or I guess his lack thereof. This is the Slender Man. Say hi, Slender Man. Close enough. Slendy here was one of many characters tied to a massive phenomena during my childhood known as Creepypasta. Basically, creepypastas were online campfire stories that spread across the internet like wildfire. And for about 4 years of my life, they were my biggest obsession. These stories were well known for being accompanied with supplemental media such as screenshots or videos that were used to make the stories in question feel more authentic. On top of this, a lot of these stories were essentially public domain. This meant that anyone, for better or worse, could contribute to these stories. An example of this is Marble Hornets, which was a found footage story told through multiple YouTube channels that served as a companion piece to Victor Surge's original Slender Man posts on the Something Awful forums. This series was responsible for creating a lot of the elements that we commonly associate today with the Slender Man, and alongside the free indie game Slender the 8 Pages, it launched the character into the stratosphere. Nowadays, the label creepypasta is often used as an umbrella term that encompasses all sorts of online horror media, such as analog horror, digital horror, or phenomena like the backrooms. But about 10 to 20 years ago, the term was strictly used to refer to horror stories along with any characters or media tied to those stories. Aside from the Slender Man, there was a plethora of other monsters as well, some more original than others. Out of the famous ones, you had characters like The Rake, Smile Dog, Sonic.exe, Ben Drowned, Laughing Jack, Mr. Widemouth, Happy Appy. Look, I didn't say they were all great. But without a doubt, one of the most prolific creepypasta characters during this period was also one of the community's most notorious and poorly written. This is Jeff the Killer. Say hi, Jeff.
My name is Jeff.
Jeffy Boy here is one of many serial killer characters in the creepypasta community. If Slenderman was akin to a monster like The Thing, then these knife-wielding maniacs were analogous to slasher movie characters like Jason Voorhees or Freddy Krueger. Aside from our boy Jeff Dunham, you also had Jane the Killer, Clockwork, and Tiki Toby, just to name a few. Most of them were strictly rip-offs of Jeffrey Dahmer here, but the point I'm trying to reach is that these characters were very prominent in the creepypasta community. Personally, I didn't mind this given that I was an edgy teenager at the time, but once I grew into an adult, I started to find this trend from the 2000s and early 2010s to be rather odd. Like, you have to admit, it's kind of weird that I and a bunch of other people were obsessing over bloodthirsty serial killers. That's not to say I think it's wrong to like horror characters. They're all fictional at the end of the day. But Jeff Bezos here is different. He and his copycats were all just lunatics with no real motives. It's not like he kills people to protect someone or because he believes in some insane ideology or whatever. So if that's the case, why were I and many others glued to these characters while we were growing up? And the reason this question is important is because it honestly applies to a lot of horror characters, even beyond the scope of creepypasta. You could literally ask the same question about a character like Michael Myers or Chucky the Doll. So that's what I want to get to the bottom of today. In this nostalgia-indulgent retrospective, I'll be going over the rise and fall of Jeff the Killer. We'll explore the not-so-humble origins, the poorly written stories that made him famous, the culture that influenced him, the litany of copycats, and the inevitable downfall of the character. And through it all, we'll try to figure out why so many people looked fondly on old Jeffy Boy, and what lessons can be learned when reviving this old character. Because let's be honest, Hollywood is going to desecrate this decade-old grave eventually, so I may as well try to lay out some pointers and words of warning while I'm here. I'm still trying to recover from 2018's Slender Man, and for whatever the fuck Channel Zero was, the latter of which will probably need its own video in the future because holy hell! The mystery of the Jeff the Killer source image is still an open investigation on the internet to this day, but the first instance of a Jeff the Killer story can be attributed to a YouTube user named Cesar. In 2008, he uploaded a video containing his origin story for Jeff the Killer. The original upload has since been taken down, but the video has been preserved. The video is presented in a slideshow format, and it's also the first instance of Jeff's brother Lou. In this story, it's explained that Jeff disfigured himself by slipping on a bar of soap in the bathtub and dropped a gallon of acid on his face. What?
God, I have so many questions. We just started.
At about the same time in 2008, a user on Newgrounds named Killer Jeff would go on to post the same image and provide his own origin story. As of the time of writing, it is commonly believed that Cesar and Killer Jeff are the same person. Killer Jeff's interpretation of the Jeff the Killer story was basically a ripoff of the Bloody Mary ritual. According to the instructions given by Killer Jeff, you were supposed to sit in your closet with your legs crossed and your eyes closed and chant for him to appear. If done correctly, Jeff would appear with his face right in front of you and would begin to scream. So to recap, we haven't even left the year 2008 yet, and already there's 2 contradicting stories related to this character from 2 users who may or may not be the same person. How are things already this convoluted? Later on in 2011, we would receive what many considered to be the proper origin story of this character. The original story was posted onto the Creepypasta wiki by the user GameFieldTV, and it was here where we would be introduced to the elements of the Jeff the Killer mythos that has since become iconic. Stuff like Randy and his goons, Lou being sent to juvie, the birthday party, Jeff's almost supernatural killer instincts, Keith lighting Jeff on fire in the bathroom, Jeff burning his eyelids and cutting a smile into his face, and his iconic catchphrase,
"Go to sleep."
In 2011, the story would later be narrated by the YouTuber Mr. Creepypasta, who gave Jeff his signature gruff voice. And not too long after, Jeff the Killer would take the internet by storm. To say that Jeff the Killer had a grip on the internet during the height of creepypasta would be the understatement of the fucking century. With the sole exception of the Slender Man himself, Jeff was pretty much the most popular creepypasta monster during the early 2010s. That's not to say it was by a long shot. There were also other beloved stories at the time like Ben Drowned, Smile Dog, or the Russian Sleep Experiment, but none of them had quite the same edge as old Jeffy Boy. And that's probably the most crucial element behind Jeff's initial popularity. Despite how campy the original story comes off as nowadays, a lot of people at the time felt that GameFuel's interpretation of Jeff the Killer was far more grounded than a Lovecraftian, forest-stalking creature like the Slender Man. It certainly helped as well that Jeff showed up during the golden age of unfiction. To briefly summarize, unfiction are stories that attempt to fully immerse their audience and present a believable alternate reality. Early creepypastas like Ted the Caver, The Wyoming Incident, and even Marble Hornets are all examples of unfiction, and they each strongly influence the goals of later stories. Simply put, creepypasta monsters like the Slender Man, Jeff the Killer, and the Rake were initially designed to be modern-day urban legends. This is further supported by the amount of sighting videos that have been staged over the last 15 years. The Slender Man especially was responsible for the creation of fictional myths such as Der Grossman, and the Rake is commonly associated with real-life urban legends such as the Skinwalkers and the Wendigo. Jeff in particular wouldn't remain an urban legend for long, but the fact remains that a lot of impressionable kids at the time used to actually believe that these creepypasta monsters were real. The closest thing I can compare it to today is something like the Backrooms. That's how big of a deal creepypasta was at the time. Not too long after the original story's release, Mr. Creepypasta would go on to narrate more spin-offs written by the community. The first of these videos were Jeff the Killer Part 2 and Jeff is Back, and they weren't anything to write home about.
In viewing this video, I logged every single one of your IP addresses and know exactly where you are.
If you thought the original story was poorly written, then these were about 10 times worse. But more importantly, they were at risk of making Jeff the Killer feel stale. No, the character wouldn't really raise the bar until Mr. Creepypasta posted his narrations of both Jeff the Killer vs. Slender Man and Jeff the Killer vs. Jane the Killer. It's my opinion that the Jeff vs. stories were probably when the character was at his cultural peak, and there's a few elements at play that made these stories so interesting at the time. First off, it was using a proven formula for its story. Anyone with some modicum of horror movie knowledge can already see the parallels with films like Alien vs. Predator or Freddy vs. Jason. So you can probably imagine that it was nothing short of an exciting slobber knocker. These stories would pit Jeff up against another creepypasta monster, and more often than not, it created a scenario where you could feasibly root for either character. Secondly, these stories were pretty much the only ones at the time attempting to further develop Jeff's character. It's with these stories where we got to see an older Jeff the Killer nearly a decade removed from the original story, one who struggles with alcoholism and a further deteriorating psyche. For those who were into the character, the scenarios presented in these stories were genuinely fascinating. Finally, these stories were among the first big crossovers in the creepypasta community. At the time, this was incredible. Most other creepypasta monsters were usually confined within the boundaries of their stories. But after Jeff vs. Slender Man, it felt like the walls had been broken and that anything could happen now in these stories. And just to remind you again, a good percentage of kids at the time believed that some of these characters were real. This wasn't like the analog horror craze where there was a careful effort to ensure that people knew these stories were fiction. These stories only further added to the urban legend of these characters. Speaking of which, this would be a good time to address the culture surrounding Creepypasta, along with the other stories chasing Jeff's success. The first major factor that contributed to the success of Jeff the Killer, that I don't think it's brought up enough, are other online trends that existed alongside the rise of Creepypasta. Between the 90s and mid-2010s, the anime phenomenon was exploding in popularity across the globe. Before the advent of legal streaming sites, the only means we had to watch anime during the 2000s and early 2010s was either catching it when it aired on channels like 4Kids or Toonami, or by pirating it online. As a result, a lot of anime fans during the mid-2000s onward were already frequent internet users. So even for the time, there was still quite a lot of overlap between the anime community and other online spaces. Beyond that, another major trend that existed at the time was emo culture and its associated aesthetic. The fad had reached its peak in popularity during the early days of Creepypasta, and I'd argue that it inadvertently influenced the design and evolution of a few Creepypasta monsters. So when you take these two trends into account and apply them to Jeff the Killer, it begins to paint a pretty clear picture. You may have noticed this already throughout the video, but a lot of the fan art I've displayed of Jeff the Killer, which is linked in the paste bin in the description, don't at me, doesn't really look much at all like his original image. His burned out lids were basically replaced with eyeshadow, and he became a lot thinner overall. The reason for this is that Jeff's design transformed as more of the community got their hands on the character. I would argue that the utilization of the anime art style, coupled with the emo aesthetic, had a major hand in popularizing the character and his stories. But that alone doesn't explain why his appearance evolved in this sort of direction. I mean, he hardly even looks that scary anymore. What was the point of these changes? Well, that leads me to my next point. The second factor in Jeff's success was the age and demographic of his audience. Most people in the Creepypasta community during this period of time were teenagers, including myself. There was also a strong, active fandom surrounding a lot of the Creepypasta monsters, which I wasn't really a part of, but it also existed and it was pretty huge. And it's with this fandom where we start to find our answer towards Jeff's design. Simply put, it's not uncommon for online spaces to find people who fangirl over fictional characters, including criminals like old Jeffy Boy. If you've ever engaged in an online fandom before, you know what I'm talking about. Fandoms provide a space for nerds and geeks of all walks of life, and with that often comes a litany of weird interests. So coupled with the younger demographic, it was basically a recipe for disaster. Jeff himself wasn't really the only character that was subjected to this sort of idolization. It's just that in the case of Jeff the Killer, a lot of casual members in the community took the changes to his design and sort of just ran with it. But why does any of this matter? The reason that I think it's important to establish these first two factors is because it helps with breaking down the Jeff the Killer character, as well as further explaining his success, so we'll briefly go over that now. For starters, Jeff has a personality that's constantly dripping with attitude. He drinks booze, he screws around with women, and he gets into fights with the police and eldritch abominations. The shit he gets up to in his stories is often so dark and edgy that it would make Shadow the Hedgehog blush. But even though this sort of childish edge was absent in the original story, Jeff still had a colorful personality to him, which was responsible for inspiring this development in his character. As far as psychotic serial killers go, Jeff the Killer checks all the boxes. While I'd argue that his character writing isn't that poorly written, we can all probably agree at least that Jeff the Killer succeeds at capturing people's attention. Whether it's the iconic design, his deteriorating psyche, his antisocial behavior, or even just the gruesome ways that he kills his victims, Jeff brings enough to the table to leave a lasting impression. Probably the biggest aspect that's unique to Jeff's character was the implementation of something called the feeling. Now, the feeling is a term used to describe the violent urges that Jeff has to keep in check in order to maintain his mental faculties. It's often written like some sort of addiction that has an iron grip on Jeff's actions, and it's responsible for the further deterioration of his psyche. While it never really went anywhere in the stories he's most known for, this element of his character was something that had a lot of potential from a character writing perspective. Another aspect of Jeff's character that people liked was the dialogue.
You're the bitch from the bar. You know, I don't know what the fuck you are, but you kind of remind me of myself. You've got a nice white face, but all you're missing is a smile.
Please. Black eyes, that little smoke and mirrors trick. You don't do what I do without seeing some shit, lady. Demons, monsters, tall motherfuckers in the woods. It comes with the territory.
Jeff's lines are often oozing with personality. While I don't think it necessarily made his character any better than his contemporaries, I do think that it helped set him apart from his peers and contributed to his popularity. While admittedly poorly executed, the original Jeff the Killer story also contained themes of bullying along with the loss of childhood innocence. Jeff was pushed into a low place due to his environment, and ultimately he ended up losing himself in the process. Even if Jeff could have somehow pulled himself back together, he would have still had to live with the fact that he killed Randy and his goons. Like, you can say whatever you want about the writing in these stories, and I'd wholeheartedly agree with you, but Game Fuel's origin for the character still had some level of substance that teenagers at the time latched onto. I don't think anyone would have bothered making all these edgy sequel stories if there wasn't something there to begin with, regardless of how admittedly shallow the original story was. And much like other influential stories, it spawned many imitators. The last big factor that resulted in Jeff the Killer's success were the many stories that attempted to ape off his initial popularity. In a way, these sorts of copycats only really serve to further reinforce Jeff's dominance as a character in the creepypasta space, because none of them ever really dethroned him in terms of relevancy. Even today, people still talk about Jeff the Killer. I won't be covering these characters in any particular order, but we will go over the important ones, starting with Tiki Toby. Toby was a boy with Tourette's and divorced parents. After a traumatic incident, Toby and his mother are reunited with his abusive father before shit hits the fan and the Slender Man gets involved. I'll avoid spoiling the rest since I'm going to be doing a narration of this story for Halloween, but even with a synopsis as brief as this, you can see that there's a lot of clear parallels with Jeff the Killer. Both of these stories star a troubled kid with factors in their lives that end up driving them over the edge, and based off of just their appearances alone, I'm sure you've already deduced that they each adopt a new persona. Out of these two, Tiki Toby has certainly held up better over the years, a courtesy that I'm unwilling to extend towards our next character. Clockwork was simultaneously the most iconic Jeff the Killer clone and one of the worst written stories in the creepypasta community. To grossly summarize, Natalie Alette was a child who suffered multiple forms of abuse from her family as well as harassment at school. Near her wit's end, she takes out her frustration by sewing the corners of her mouth shut. Her parents take her to the hospital to seek mental help, because, it's clearly not the result of other factors going on in her life. And she wakes up during the middle of her surgery when the doctors are trying to repair her mouth. Her eyes are altered as a result of her botched surgery, and now obsessed with her new look, Natalie goes on a killing spree. She escapes the hospital, murdering doctors and security in her wake. Then she goes home, squad wipes her family, and burns down the house after replacing one of her eyes with a watch. Where the fuck do I begin with this one? Her story is basically just a right-click thesaurus version of the Jeff the Killer story, and Natalie's character is a list of checkboxes which only exist to make you pity her, because the author doesn't want anyone to hate their character. Their bland, two-dimensional character that's a psychotic serial killer, a character archetype that we're predisposed to hate. Though Clockwork does pose an interesting question. Why do people like these characters at all? Well, it depends, I think. Between Jeff and Toby, the major factor that separates these two is that Jeff is a psychotic monster and Toby isn't. In the case of a character like Tiki Toby, the question you're trying to answer is why do people like sympathetic villains? The reason Toby's transformation works in his story is because there isn't any sort of enjoyment towards the transformation on his part. Toby's fate was pretty much sealed the moment the Slender Man set his sights on him, and the catalyst for this happening was a traumatic event that he had no control over. While you could argue that Toby should have just tried to face his problems head on like the characters in Marvel Hornets, you have to remember that Toby was still a kid. Aside from the fact that he couldn't explain these occurrences to his parents or run away from home to seek out his own answers, there's also the fact that he couldn't just leave his mother alone with his abusive father. All Toby could realistically do was play the hand he had been dealt. Meanwhile, Jeff's origin story isn't framed as tragic whatsoever. Unlike Toby's story, it only really exists to provide context for how you became a disfigured serial killer. So when analyzing why people like Jeff the Killer, along with other slasher movie villains, the question you really have to ask is, why do people like heartless monsters? Now that might sound kind of odd, considering that Jeff, Toby, and even Clockwork share a very similar framework in terms of their origin stories. I mean, Clockwork literally takes parts of Jeff's story whole cloth. But when we consider that Jeff took pleasure in his transformation, as well as butchered his parents in cold blood, it becomes clear that Jeff, unlike Toby, is just a fucked up individual. There's really not a lot separating Jeff the Killer from a character like Michael Myers in terms of his origin story. The only difference is that Jeff has a much more colorful personality that puts him in line with characters like Chucky or Freddy Krueger. He's just comically evil, and it only gets ramped up to 11 in later stories, to the point where it's to the character's own detriment. And that right there, this acknowledgement of just how fucked up this hoodie-wearing psychopath is, starts to get at the root of why I and many others find this kind of character fascinating. Just like any other piece of fiction, these monsters and the stories that they come from provide us a safe space where we're able to step back and reevaluate either ourselves, our position in life, or our surroundings. It's just that they do so by attempting to scare the ever-living hell out of us. From my own personal experience, creepypastas along with other horror outlets provided me a sort of escape when I was growing up. There was a sort of comfort in knowing that my life could be a hell of a lot worse than it currently was. But now, as an adult with a YouTube channel and aspirations of becoming a writer, I tend to consume these sorts of media because I want to understand what really makes these stories tick. Both of these reasons are completely valid, and they're hardly the only reasons as to why people find personal interest in these stories and characters. Maybe there's something about the design or personality of these monsters which resonates with you. Maybe you think that a certain monster's concept is terrifyingly brilliant. Maybe the stories they inhabit elicit memories from your past. Or maybe you just enjoy seeing a bunch of snot-nosed brats get chased by a dude in a hockey mask. Whatever the reason may be, there's always something about these characters that ends up sticking with people. So going back to Clockwork, the reason she doesn't work, aside from the fact that the story's just tasteless, is because the author is trying to have their cake and eat it too. On the one hand, the author wants their character to be a sympathetic villain like Tiki Toby because they want people to like their character. And hey, I get that from an author's standpoint. It's not a good writing practice, but it's a pretty common mistake that beginners make when creating a new character. However, Clockwork also pulls aspects from Jeff's story that puts her more in line with traditional slasher villains. So as a result, we end up with a mix of both these character archetypes. And while I don't think it's impossible to write a character that complex, it was beyond the author's capability to pull it off. Overall, Clockwork is just bad, and the story fails to understand why either Tiki Toby or Jeff the Killer worked. The kindest thing you can say about it is that it was still an original standalone story. Jane the Killer is about as derivative as it gets. Much like Clockwork, she's basically just a gender-swapped Jeff the Killer, with the only difference being that she has a score to settle with old Jeffy boy. It also doesn't help that Jane, much like Jeff, has multiple conflicting origin stories. For the sake of this video, we'll be going over the one written by Goldcoin. It's the only version of Jane's story on Mr. Creepypasta's channel, so for all intents and purposes, a majority of people in the community see this story as canon to the original Jeff the Killer creepypasta. Jane's story is written as a secondhand account of the Jeff the Killer story throughout his first half, and it goes to painful lengths to remain faithful to not only Gamefuel's story, but also later spin-offs like the Jeff vs. stories. Jane has this air of self-importance throughout the story that ends up driving a lot of her actions, and she feels responsible for what happens to Jeff because of an early interaction between her and Randy. Later on, Jane ends up moving to another town, and she starts having nightmares about her hand in Jeff's transformation before Jeff ends up finding her. He kills her family and ties her up in the basement of her home, and Jane basically offers herself up to him, thinking that this whole thing is some sick form of destiny. Jeff gives her a reality check, lights her in the house on fire, and then flees. Jane ends up offering herself to some sort of dark god, and she dies in the fire before being reborn as Jane the Killer. This story is about as bad as the original Jeff the Killer creepypasta, which is probably the kindest thing I can say since we know that it could have been a lot worse. It's certainly a step up from Clockwork, considering that Jane is at least her own character. But I do wish there was more to her story besides her being a paranoid worrywart. While the story's not anything to write home about, I do appreciate the attempt that went into fleshing out the school setting. What I really wish this story did was try to establish an actual relation between Jeff and Jane. She only talks to him once, and then after that, she just starts obsessing over him like crazy. What I would have really liked was if they had given Jane a scene with Jeff while he was recovering in the hospital. That's pretty much the only other place in this story where Gold Coin could have further built up Jane's obsession with Jeff. Perhaps she could have seen some sort of sign that Jeff was going to end his family, but we never really get anything like that. She only meets his mom once while he's recovering, and then his family gets killed off. It's just a waste of potential, since it could have helped build up the later events in the story. All in all, these copycats were nothing more than a form of flattery that only really served to elevate Jeff the Killer. But the oversaturation and poor writing of these characters would force people to reevaluate the quality of Jeff's stories, which would usher in the beginning of the end. When talking about Jeff the Killer's decline, there are two major events that really cemented the death of this character. The first is undoubtedly the Slender Man stabbing incident that occurred in 2014. And I mean, I get it. This thing was national news, and it had a lot of people worried about the dangers of spreading urban myths. This event, along with the rise of mascot horror franchises like Five Nights at Freddy's, pretty much neutered the relevance of creepypasta for half a decade. It wasn't really until stuff like the Backrooms when creepypastas began to slowly return to form. The second event that destroyed the character's relevance were the failed attempts to reboot Jeff the Killer. I do want to stress that the re-evaluation of this character was an inevitability. Despite my praise towards Jeff in certain areas, I still don't think these stories are well written. This goes double for Jeff versus Jane. The ending twist especially gives me whiplash whenever I go back and read it. It's just completely unnecessary. The only reason I'm even able to go back and enjoy the original Jeff the Killer stories is because they're entertaining in the same way as a campy film. For me at least, there's a charm that comes from amateur authors trying to write such serious horror stories. That all being said, I would like to see someone write a story with this version of the character again. I just think there's a lot of untapped potential. But this posed a problem for the community. When one of your mascots is a horribly written mess, what are you supposed to do? This was a question that the admins at the Creepypasta Wiki had to address, and their decision was questionable. For starters, the admins moved the original Jeff the Killer stories, along with many other awful creepypastas like Sonic.exe, off of the site. I personally find that this was overkill, considering a lot of classic creepypastas were never well written to begin with. Not even fan-favorite stories like No End House or The Strangest Security Tape I've Ever Seen hold a candle to genuine masterpieces like Pen Pal or Baraska, so this was just a shot in the foot more than anything. Part of the appeal of creepypasta was that anyone could write a story with the potential of it blowing up online. And in the case of certain authors like Dathan Auerbach or Chris Strobe, the creepypasta community served as a stepping stone in their larger career. So placing such a high barrier to entry only really hindered the growth of the creepypasta phenomenon. However, the admins of the wiki went one step further. Not too long after the removal of the Jeff the Killer creepypasta, the admins ended up holding a contest to rewrite Jeff the Killer. And it's here where I feel like we really lost the charm of what made Jeff the Killer enjoyable. Because let's get something straight. The campy edge is part of the experience when reading the original stories. There's a cheesy attitude with the characters and events in Jeff's stories that has to be preserved, or else you end up with a completely different experience. And if that's your goal when rebooting the character, then that's fine. But you have to be aware that the fans of the original story may take issue with the changes being made to the tone of the story. My thoughts on the Jeff the Killer reboot are mixed. On a technical level, these stories are more competently written than the original Jeff the Killer stories ever were by a wide margin. Pretty much all the characters have a clear purpose and a list of motives that drive their actions, and the addition of detective characters greatly expands on ideas originally introduced in Jeff is Back, which I liked a lot. However, these stories sadly get lost in the plot after a certain point. By the time the story gets to all the color bullshit, I just completely lose interest. It's not even a Jeff the Killer story anymore at that point, which sucks because I really wanted to give these stories a chance. Banning K, the author behind the Jeff the Killer reboot, is clearly a talented author. He's not Stephen King or some shit, but he's pretty good at writing characters. I especially like what he does with Randy and Jane in the sequels, and the idea of there being some anarchist cult running rampant in the seedy little town of Mandeville is interesting to say the least. But you have to remember that the events of these stories all still happen because of a scuffle between teenagers. The premise behind the reboot is just patently absurd. I know people give the original Jeff the Killer stories a lot of shit since it's just a single kid evading the police, but I would argue that this is even more unrealistic. We're talking about a group of anarchists worshipping and carrying out crimes and murders in the name of a single kid evading the police. But my biggest issue with these stories was the need to try and preserve the story beats of the original Jeff the Killer creepypasta to begin with. What was the point of retelling Gamefiel's origin story when the character ends up just taking a back seat in the sequels? YouTuber I Have a Bad Username has described these stories before as essentially being a worse version of Baraska, and I kinda have to agree with him on that. The appeal of Jeff the Killer is Jeff the Killer. It just feels like these stories completely misunderstand why people enjoyed this character in the first place. So after these two incidents, Jeff along with the creepypasta community as a whole pretty much fell into irrelevance. But after everything that we've covered in this video, one question still remains. Will Jeff the Killer return? Yes, thank you for watching. Okay, maybe I should elaborate more. If this essay is anything to go off of, it's either that I hyperfixate on stuff way too much on this channel, or that I really think there's a demand to see more stories of this character. Most likely both. There's been some renewed interest in Jeff the Killer in recent years, but it has to do with the origins of the image that started this all. That being said, I figure it's only a matter of time before someone attempts another reboot. And if you're an aspiring writer, I say,
go for it.
While Jeff the Killer isn't a part of the public domain, you could say the same thing about the Slender Man, and that didn't stop independent creators from taking that idea and turning it into something massive. Jeff provides an incredibly bare-bones template for any new author wanting to write horror stories, and because of that, I believe it would be very easy for someone to do their own take on the character and his mythos. It especially helps that the creepypasta fandom is nowhere near as big as it used to be, so there isn't a lot of pressure nowadays to adhere to previous stories like with the Banning K reboot. I think if you have a cool idea for the character, you should be encouraged to take that idea and run with it. It's that sort of bravery which made the Slender Man into what he became, and I think that so much more could still be done with old Jeffy Boy. If I had to give my thoughts on what direction to take another Jeff the Killer reboot in, I would probably try to write something that's more in the spirit of the original stories. I probably don't speak for the majority of the creepypasta community, but I personally didn't mind the supernatural elements from the sequel stories, such as Jeff's ability to resurrect or Jane's ability to shapeshift. If anything, it only served to make these characters feel more monstrous. I wouldn't mind if a reboot carried over these aspects and further expanded on it. Secondly, I think that Jeff should have a greater presence as an antagonist in his stories. I'm fine with there still being stuff like the Jeff versus stories where he's more of a protagonist, but those stories really should be done sparingly. One of my favorite moments from the original Jeff the Killer stories probably has to be the babysitter scene from Jeff vs. Jane. It's here where we really get to see what Jeff is capable of when he's written as the antagonist. The atmosphere, the setup and execution, Jeff's demeanor and headspace, and just the overall gruesome display. It's a perfectly horrifying and well-executed scene that still manages to maintain the tone of a Jeff the Killer story. If an aspiring author can manage to capture that sort of tone, then I promise you that their story will do really well. Finally, I think it's worth preserving the tone and attitude from the original stories. Part of the character's appeal was Jeff's design and his personality, and it was one of the aspects that I felt was lost in translation during the 2015 reboot. Like, if you're going to do this character, just keep the original design and attitude. People like that about the character. If another author can still manage to capture what made the original Jeff the Killer an entertaining villain, while still making him a terrifying monster, then you'll have something big on your hands. But hey, those are just my thoughts on what could be done. Whether you're looking to revitalize the character or you just want to write a bunch of funny shitpost stories, the choice is yours. Just whatever you do, don't let those ghouls in Hollywood fuck everything up like they did with the Slender Man. This isn't a joke, by the way. The Slender Man was sold to Mythology Entertainment in 2016 and is currently in copyright limbo. Our childhoods are becoming commodities. We are living in a dystopian Thank you so much for watching this video. These projects take me a while to produce since I make them independently during my time off work, so your support and feedback really means a lot. Feel free to like and subscribe if you enjoy what I do on this channel. And if there's anything you thought I missed, or you just didn't like the video, then that's fine, I guess. For those who haven't been following my community posts, the Wet Dry World video is currently going through rewrites. So editing on that project, along with the animatic sequence I'm making for it, is currently on pause until that's finished. I'm really looking forward to sharing it when it's done. I had initially made this video with the intent to propose a potential collab with Mr. Creepypasta, but the story I'm writing won't be ready in time for this Halloween. It's another Jeff versus story, and the best way I can describe it is that it's a very high-effort shitpost. All I can say about it right now is that it involves a certain night guard and a small business owner. Hopefully, it'll be done sometime next year. As for more immediate projects, there's 2 in the works. The first is a video on alternate card arts in Yu-Gi-Oh! And the second is going to be a video on info hazards, since I want to cover more horror-related topics on this channel as well. But beyond that, I plan to discuss all sorts of other things in the future. Books, movies, music, games, whatever really interests me. So there's a plethora of stuff I'm going to yap about on this channel, and I hope you all look forward to that. Again, thank you so much for watching this to the end, and I'll see you all in the next one.